Hold on, give me 1 second. Or go ahead. Okay. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Just take your bangs and do this. That's better. Yes.
Okay.
I'm just gonna...
How's my posture? Does it look good?
Yes.
Okay,
It
let's
looks
do
very
this.
good. Okay, so... Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Tanshi, Brett Douglas McDowell, Dishinikashon, which is Michif, si Malang, which in my language is Michif, Michif person, and that's how we introduce ourselves. So it's Brett Douglas McDowell, and I'm Michif.
Nice to meet you.
Pleasure.
So tell me, what do you do, or what are you passionate in?
What do I do when I'm passionate in? It's a weird question. That's a tough one because I want a storyteller. Because I want to be a storyteller, but colonialism. So storytelling isn't how it normally was or what I'd want it to be because it's based on colonial paradigm, which is vaudeville and royal patronage from theaters. And so I guess in my heart of hearts, I'm a Kijita, I'm a warrior, and I'm a storyteller, and those kind of merged together with different philosophical religious duties within Nehiyaw, which is the Iron Confederacy, which is my nation inside of Canada. So I'm Canadian, but I'm also Nehiyaw. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Sure.
Makes sense. So would you be able to tell us how Indigenous storytelling is different from the North American conventional storytelling method?
Well, it's divided from class and society, and that's a big thing. Is, like I said, it's kind of talking about like the Globe Theatre and all the royal patronage theatre companies in the UK and the rest of Europe. And so there was always a division between the ones that had royal patronage, which were moneyed, and they were in a lot of ways the Anglo-Saxon high class, and they were expensive to go to. You couldn't go to them the same way you could with something like vaudeville that emerged in the early 1900s, like late 1900s, late 19th century in New York and other places in the world, especially in France. But vaudeville was that accessible theater, and that kind of bled into film, like the first cinema. And so even at the beginning of Hollywood, there was kind of a class difference between, the high-end stuff, which is like, of course, based on the Anglo-Saxon Broadway. And then it kind of was the vaudeville, the low class, the immigrants. And that's when film came in, and that's also when the early Jewish community started developing Hollywood. And it's because they were kicked out of every other industry. So it's kind of like the whole part of cinema started from all these immigrant groups that were pushed out of basic society. And that was because largely Anglo-Saxon Protestant upper class that looked down upon it. And so that's kind of where that view of an actor came from a lot of cultures. Either you came from the royal patronage or you came from kind of the low-class vaudeville. And that still bleeds into how we see cinema and film today. Now, with the indigenous way, it's a bit different because storytelling, everyone was a storyteller. Everyone did the gestures. Everyone had the voice. Everyone was always trying to be a storyteller, which is now kind of like where we stand with Instagram, right? Everyone's a storyteller. Everyone's telling their story to the world. And so if you're telling stories, you're telling stories to storytellers. And it's like it's like performing Beethoven for a bunch of concert pianists. You're going to have a very different paradigm relating to it. Not only that, is Indigenous storytelling was crucial to governance structures and peacekeeping structures. So if you look at it, you really couldn't have a police service without storytelling. And you couldn't have a parliament without storytelling. You couldn't have a judiciary without storytelling. Because storytelling was so integral to how you passed information and how you passed laws and how you worked with living memory. It had the place of precedent in common law courts. And so that storytelling was so centralized a part of the society that storytellers were central figures within that society, and they had extending duties beyond simple entertainment. It was entertaining, but it just naturally extended beyond because of how we thought of ourselves and how we governed ourselves. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So the weight and the responsibility of storytellers is far more heavy than conventional North American storytellers or performers.
Yeah, you had different standards. You had different ethical standards. They said vaudeville was kind of the bohemian side subculture. And it's not really a subculture. Storytelling isn't a subculture. Like I said, in Anglo-Saxon society, you had people who were on the outskirts, the bohemians. Those were the performers. Or you had the fool, who was the only person who criticized the king. But they weren't, the main governors of society. But again, in indigenous society, they were the people governing and influencing how society functioned. And that type of communication was essential for everything from childcare to judicial matters.
So it seems as if a lot of North American conventional storytellers or performers, since they didn't have that weight, they could actually go off the rails a bit in terms of responsibility and
You mean they went all vaudeville?
Can you elaborate on that?
No, vaudeville being like the outside part of society where basic social norms weren't really applied, but that also a lot of times became the space for, malfeasance or deviant behavior. Not that I'm judging people's preferences. I'm just stating that rules are good as long as they're fair. And there was unfair rules that vaudeville and bohemian society circumvented. But if you have a society that has good rules, you don't have to circumvent rules. And so them being the outsider versus the insider is just basically cultural paradigms. Does that answer your question, or is that...
Right. Well, you said that, for example, the fool kept the king in check.
You mean fool's privilege?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, fool's privilege is... Every comedian knows fool's privilege. I mean, it's kind of the concept of modern American media, is that comedians, why they have to be free in their comedy is because they're the only ones who can criticize the king. And everyone else would, again, have to kind of suck up to the king, and they'd have to be deferential, and they'd always have to let him maintain a certain amount of face. Where the fool, it was dismissed. He could say stupid things because he was allowed to. That was his role in society. It's a very segmented role, and that role in indigenous society, at least like the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Michif, you had specific cousins that would make sure to make fun of you if you went too far. If you transgressed laws, you'd be made fun of. If you really just got too big of yourself, you would be kind of ripped on, and that was to make sure that you weren't overly reactive. You didn't take yourself so seriously, and your skin wasn't thin. It wasn't a bullying because it wasn't meant to hurt you. It was always to educate you to live in a good way with Wahkohtowin, and to be in a good way. And so you couldn't tease someone in a bad way. It wasn't like punching down. It wasn't hurtful. It was meant to, sober you up, to give you a sense of reality, and to make sure you're connected and you know what's going on. And again, you're doing things in a good way. So that's the difference. Is fool's privilege was the only person who could speak to the king, while comedy in the concept of Wahkohtowin was to make sure everyone's acting in a good way.
Right, to keep their feet on the ground.
Well, they're head in the ground. They're head in the game.
Right. So, and based on that, it seems as if that type of interaction is not that very common within performers in the Western world.
You mean Hollywood?
Yeah, it seems like because that's not really employed, then it creates a lot of people with kind of the prima donna mentality.
Well, see, the thing about Hollywood is it's, you become from a generation of people famous for being famous. That was the start of Instagram, reality TV. It's like 20-year generation of an explosion of new media and new channels, and it creates a very different paradigm because Hollywood is more about fame than it is about storytelling at certain points. Not to say storytelling isn't present, but the ethics of it is almost hierarchical. And it's a weird thing because it's American society, because in the UK they still have the monarchy. And so people follow the monarchy like they follow celebrities in the UK. But it also means that there's someone above them, at least in the kind of ceremonial social hierarchy. But in the States, especially because there's such criticism towards the president, you don't have that same relationship with the president as you do with the monarchy. And that's by design. But the issue is that hole has kind of been filled since new media in the modern age by like rock stars and performers. And that is trying to merge with fool's privilege. So you're essentially taking someone whose role was to criticize the king in that construct, or vaudeville, which was very bohemian and on the edge, and then you're kind of trying to push that into what is essentially an indigenous whole, because it's so, in the same way in indigenous society, stories permeate everything. Every campfire is constantly, every part of your life, ceremony, education. We're always dealing with stories now. It's always separated into memes or different bites or different sound bites, or it's YouTube or it's Instagram or it's Twitter or it's any other place you're getting these segments of media that have been broken down. And so then it does in some ways resemble more of an Aboriginal concept, like an Indigenous concept. And I don't think that vaudeville fool dynamic is truly living in a good way, because, well, there's 16 billion mobile products, 16 billion eyes on the planet. And you get into the Prima Donna, and Prima Donna was a name who was put up in lights, and it was big, and you could market it, and people can make assumptions and fantasies about that person. So you can imagine that they're this way. You can imagine if you dealt with them, it would be like this. And you can put yourself in that circumstance. It allowed kind of an escapism. With Indigenous society, you usually knew the storyteller, or you knew of them, and you knew their reputation, you knew their people. And so there was a much more fixed reputation, but that's more what it's like now, because reputation is so fixed and so specific, it's returning back to the old ways. There's a reason they call it digital natives, because it is returning to the old ways where your reputation is very fixed. And you have PR firms that try to modify and mold that image, and that was a bygone age when there was less participation in storytelling, where you were used to having an elite media constantly maintaining a narrative, which is different than an elite by meritocracy, the best storytellers, the best writers, the best journalists. And elitism is very different than the best, the cream of the crop. Elitism a lot of times is maintaining power by name and by environment. And so that's kind of been the name of the game for Hollywood for the last 20, 30 years, maybe longer. There's different times when there's different studio configurations that had different results. But yes, you always want to brand someone as a movie star. And that's how you marketed it. And then you're able to control the narrative and the spin relating to it. And that's why the paparazzi was first hired. They had people taking photos of Marilyn, and the studio paid for them. Then it kind of took on a life of its own and gets into Life is Beautiful, and the whole concept of that changed. The Princess Di, where you had the paparazzi in the UK going completely out of control. And then, that you still had some manufacturing control of the narrative. You had random breakdowns, which is like kind of, you see the case of Britney Spears, we have the media bullying and how that worked out. And that was, the 90s, 2000 kind of way of thinking about it. And that kind of faded into reality TV. We had the Kardashians, and then you start breaking into internet time, and then you just had, scandal, Me Too, and it just breaks. You had Ellen come out. You had all of these things where people have created these manufactured public images for PR firms, and they don't live up to scrutiny. And the reality is that there is a complex set of media scrutiny now through these 16 billion eyes. Remember, those eyes all have brains attached to them. They're all dissecting information. They're all dealing with it. So it becomes an exceedingly losing battle to try and have two faces. It becomes very difficult. So you either are or you aren't who you pretend to be. Sorry, let's say again. You either are or you aren't. If you pretend to be someone, it's going to come out. If you're trying to two-face it, it's going to come out. It's really a matter of time. It's almost inevitable. But in Indigenous society, because you're having direct access, because you're going to powwow, or you're going to ceremony, you're going to le rendezvous from the Michif, we had like kitchen parties, and we had all these things where someone's going to find out who you are because they talk to people, they have their cousins, your family members, and it's a big part of that social process. And that's why a lot of the positions in those societies were much more based on your ability to have merit, and it was just a more stable thing. And you don't have the same stability with you don't have the same stability if you're faking it, you're hiding it. That goes back to the Prima Donnas, where Prima Donnas were fundamentally the big names on light, and they're a big name, big draw because it's easy, because you know who they are. You recognize them. And then people go, oh, I know that person, I'll go see that. But that's not necessarily the case anymore. It's even more complex because you have cultural heroes, which again is more indigenous because you have like Nanabush, you have Kikwatsu. You have these cultural heroes within indigenous society that people keep going back and retelling those stories like franchises. And it, in some ways, overshadows the performer, which is fine. Actually, that's not a bad thing. It's good for the ego, honestly. And again, the Prima Donnas, the movie star, the big name in lights. And, I don't think that's necessarily the best storytelling because egos tend to get in the way of good storytelling, especially when you're developing scenes. But, yeah, I think that's about it. Does that make sense?
Yes, I just want to clarify, when you mean prima donnas, you mean both all genders, right?
Prima donna in Italian is a gender term, but in English it means anyone. It has no relationship to sex. So it's just no relationship to gender. So
Gender
no, it just means a certain type of behaviors. And it just basically means someone with a bad attitude who has a specific talent that you protect from the public while marketing them. And that's a prima donna, right? So.
Well, thanks for clarifying.
No.
So, the prima donnas, how you said they feel like they have two faces. So, a lot of people in Hollywood do. Do you feel as if they're trying to cover up insecurities? And how do they cover up insecurities if they do?
Well, you're talking about someone who maintains gatekeeping, because prima donnas are fundamentally gatekeepers, because they're aware that one, if the public knows how they are, they're done. And two, if they compete fairly, a lot of times they know that they won't stand up, and they've built things up around them to keep them in that position, which a lot of times involves, because they have to be dishonest, they bring dishonest people around them, and so that results in abuses, especially to people within a hierarchy of power structure or subordinates. And I'd argue that is kind of a linchpin in how Me Too functions and how people keep trying to create that power dynamic and then they exploit it. And someone who is not as confident in their ability and their circumstance and able to the ability to maintain it without a manufactured image is going to be more tolerant of the kind of people that will exploit other people in that way, because they're creating a system that hides it. And it's that same thing. It's like, well, no one will believe you because we've manufactured a system where people believe me. That there's a very specific way you got to believe. People don't believe themselves. They don't believe the more complexities of the experience, or that you have a control of what's going to go out. And that's an illusion now. I mean, Harvey Weinstein showed one thing, is that you can't monopolize that anymore. You can hire yourself an Israeli intelligence officer, and you're still going to go to jail. That's where you're at, right? So I don't know. It's in a lot of ways, the fixers are done because you can't really do anything anymore. That old way of thinking and hiding things doesn't really work anymore. And it's just a liability, because the second you do that, and now because everything is, you go through streaming, all of your old catalog is going to lose value when something comes out. And when you have an inevitable loss of value based on a prima donna, based on that behavior, that's a huge business risk. And I can't see anyone with a fiduciarily responsible sense banking on individuals like that. Especially if you got that kind of baggage. You got to be very specific with it, and you have to be very accurate with it. And so that means that the best thing you need is people who are not prima donnas, people who are actually responsible. I think the issue is people have this view that you can only be a great performer if you're a prima donna. And that's because of the marketing of it. That's because you're so used to the prima donna being high maintenance. It's worth it dealing with them. But the reality is you don't have to be a prima donna to be good at your job and have these emotions. I think that's, again, based on the American way of thinking when it comes to acting and acting methodology, which is kind of like the Meisner and like the whole, what's the word for, substitution. When you substitute your own emotions for the character. And I'm not of that school. I see it more so as, British technique acting, where your experience does inform how you craft a character. But if you're not looking at the character, if you're not observing the character, then the character doesn't exist. So it's through your observation that the character exists. While if you use your own emotion substitution, you completely lose sight of the fact that you're the character. The character is no longer real. It's just a mishmash of your emotions, and it will fit itself to all of your faults and weaknesses. And I mean, that's character acting in a nutshell. You become a person to it. Not to say that you still can't develop more. It's not that you need variations in your performance for like technique versus character acting, but it's just not usually psychologically healthy, and it tends towards people who have a prima donna set of behaviors and a prima donna set of thinking. So, yeah. It's important for stability to make sure your acting methodology doesn't cloud your view of the character. And that's basically the takeaway.
So if people use the acting where you lose yourself, then do you think that a lot of the people that have risen up feel like frauds?
I don't know if that's what makes them feel like frauds, because I don't really have an issue with that like, it's a functional technique to a certain extent, and it's a limited technique in my opinion. But I think that they feel like frauds. A lot of people feel like frauds for two reasons: because of imposter syndrome, because they're irrationally feeling they don't belong where they are, or alternately they've rationally done dodgy things. They've done bad things to get where they are. They have looked the other way on things. They've done things that were unethical, that were unreasonable to get there. And then they're never going to feel comfortable. And a lot of times doing bad things and having a guilty conscience, like the telltale heart, right? Or like out damn spot. You never get past that. It's always part of who you are. It's part of you as a performer. It's part of your life. It's part of your work, and you never escape it. So there's no way to really escape those deals with the devil, so to speak. It's not like it frees you from it. You're always restrained by it, and your performance and everything you do will always be restrained by it, and you'll never be able to be free as a performer. So it's better that you create an environment where performers can come up without making those more compromises, because their work will be infinitely better, and it won't be tainted with that darkness.
Which is where the indigenous traditional method is more effective and safer and better for society all around.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's better for society because it's about rewarding good behavior and talent. And that there's certain recognition that talent comes from good behavior. And that's the controversial thing I'm going to say is talent comes from good behavior, from being in a good way, from being productive. And like I said, when people get to that position, they just try to maintain it with the resources they've created to build it, because, it's not a liquid circumstance. It's a hierarchy. And you're used to that being there, and you get attached to it. You get used to it, and you don't know how to live any other way, because your entire mentality and all the compromises you've made require you to keep going. They require you to keep at it. Otherwise, what was all for, right? And that's just that toxic mentality that does create prima donnas, but also creates bad art, because you're not a good performer if you're stuck in that. You can't get out of yourself. You have to resolve that and be able to and this is again controversial, is that something good for a performer is honor. If you don't have honor, you don't have a clean slate. Your mind is not clear to create a character. It's like trying to paint on a canvas that's already been painted on. Unless you can clear your canvas to create the character, you can't really ever truly create the character to the level you really want to do. And so again, you have to be able to let go of everything to create that character. If you can't, then your character will always be flawed. And not flawed in the way where you develop complex flaws for the character, in that it will be corrupted. And so you don't want to be constantly creating corrupted performances based on your own, depending on the context, the deviancy that could be present if you've made moral compromises.
Very wise. So, if you could convey how important storytelling is to prima donnas, while somehow helping them to overcome their blocks or struggles by influencing them into the more healthy indigenous method, what would you say?
I'd say, bring me that nouveau shamanic. No, no, I mean, I would say that you're never getting what you want. If you want to be a good performer, you got to let go. You can't be stuck in that. And especially you can't be stuck in your position and maintaining it. Your performance will never be what you want it to be. So you're going to be always disappointed with yourself in reality. If you're trying to maintain something and you're making more compromises, you're always going to be disappointed with reality. Understanding what makes you disappointed with reality is not... your failures may disappoint you, but understand that certain successes disappoint you as well. You have to understand which successes, if they're not done in a good way with Wahkohtowin, if they're not done in a good way, they will disappoint you. And your performance will disappoint you. Everything you do disappoints you. And living with a constant disappointment means you're going to be angry, insecure, and lash out. And so if you live in a good way, you won't have that disappointment. And that's the point, is if you're always disappointed with yourself in what you produce, then you'll never escape it. And no matter what you do, you're stuck. And so all you have to do is live in a good way, which is Wahkohtowin. You have to do things in a good way. And understand that now how story works is not about you. It's not about your ego. It's about medicine for society. And, someone was misbehaving, you'd tell a story about the misbehavior. And you'd help them understand the misbehavior. And so you have to see yourself more as a helper and see your work more as medicine. And you have to understand that it's just not about you. It's like, okay, this is kind of funny, because this is like the crow. And this is like the Shnabe, like the Ojibwe way to think of the crow. Is the crow didn't know what his purpose, what his gift was in life, right? So the crow would, watch the bear do his medicines, or he'd go to different animals and, come to understand them. And he could never figure out what his purpose was, just nothing. And so eventually he talked to, I think it's one bird specifically, had him say, hey, you should go see the bear. He's got good medicine and he will teach you. And then the crow brought this one animal to the bear, and that one bird found its gift through talking to the bear. And in a lot of ways, performers are like crows in that way, because through the telling, you're directing people to things within themselves. And that's what it is that you're a helper. You are to help people find things within themselves through your performance, through pointing. And your actions and your performance is pointing. It's the finger pointing at the moon, not the moon itself. And this, not to get too much into Asian mysticism, but absolutely your performance is the finger pointing at the moon. You are not the moon. And once you can make that separation, then you can act. Then you can understand. And then you could perform as a healthy person, because it's the finger pointing at the moon. You're not the moon. You're the pointer. And to understand that you're directing the audience to these emotions, these things within themselves, that's when you realize it's not about you. And that's when you can actually do real good. And that's when storytelling can have a transcendent, almost mythical effect on people, their lives, and the world around you. And that's the magic.
That's really cool. I like that a lot. Hopefully your story about trying to help people, trying to find the point, the direction to the moon will help. Does that make sense?
But what do I know? I'm just a half-breed.
Is there anything else you'd like to say?
No, that's pretty much it.
Well, thank you for taking the time to speak with me and to the audience and informing us more about Indigenous storytelling.
I hope it was helpful.
Yeah, it was very helpful.
Okay.
I think. All right.
I'll have a pleasant evening or afternoon, or have something pleasant.
Thank you.
Hopefully. I'm pleasant. I don't want to tell you what to do.